Douglas Benefield believed he'd found love again when he met Sophia Lane, but what he didn't know was that she was studying him, not loving him, waiting for the perfect moment to end his life. Douglas Benefield was the kind of man people trusted instantly. He spoke softly, listened carefully, and carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who had lived through loss and learned to move forward. A widower in his early 40s, Douglas spent most of his time building his small defense technology company and raising his teenage daughter. He lived in a modest yet elegant house in Charleston, where life moved at a steady rhythm, until the day he met Sophia Lane. Sophia entered his life like a sudden summer storm, beautiful, unpredictable, and impossible to ignore. She was a ballet instructor who had recently moved to town, claiming to be starting over after a difficult breakup. Her grace and poise drew people in, but what truly captured Douglas's attention was her vulnerability. She spoke about her dreams, her fears, her love for art, and her longing for stability. Douglas saw in her the chance to rebuild a family he had lost. To him, Sophia was not just beautiful. She was someone who needed protecting, and he had always been the kind of man who wanted to protect. Their relationship moved quickly, far too quickly for those around them to understand. Within weeks, Sophia was appearing at his business dinners dressed elegantly, clinging to his arm like they had been together for years. Friends warned him to slow down, to take his time, but Douglas ignored them. After years of loneliness, he believed life was giving him another chance at happiness. When he proposed to her just a few months later, she said yes with tears in her eyes and a trembling smile that looked almost rehearsed. Their wedding was small and quiet, held in the backyard of his home beneath strings of white lights and soft music. Douglas looked genuinely happy for the first time in years. His daughter, though polite, kept her distance. She told a friend she couldn't shake the feeling that something about Sophia wasn't real. Still, she stayed silent, not wanting to ruin her father's joy. The honeymoon phase seemed perfect at first. Sophia filled the house with laughter and charm, redecorating rooms, planning dinners, and sharing photos of their life online. To the world, they looked like a couple deeply in love, the kind that found each other against all odds. But cracks began to form almost immediately. Sophia was quick to anger over small things: a missed text, a business call that ran too long, an evening Douglas spent with his daughter instead of her. She accused him of not caring enough, of treating her like a trophy instead of a wife. Douglas tried to soothe her, believing her mood swings were signs of stress or insecurity. He had no idea that what he was seeing was the first glimpse of who she truly was. When friends visited, Sophia was all smiles and charm. But the moment they left, her demeanor changed. She would go silent, scrolling through her phone, her expression unreadable. Douglas noticed she spent hours talking to people he didn't know, sometimes whispering in another room. When he asked who she was speaking to, she brushed him off, saying he was being paranoid. He let it go, choosing peace over confrontation. Slowly, Douglas began to lose himself in the chaos. The once calm, confident man started to look tired, distracted, and uncertain. He made excuses for Sophia's behavior, convincing himself that every marriage had rough patches. What he didn't realize was that Sophia's affection was never love, it was performance. Behind every sweet gesture, every tearful apology was calculation. She studied Douglas carefully, learning his weaknesses, understanding how to manipulate his emotions. To outsiders, they were still the picture of happiness, a graceful wife and her devoted husband. But inside that quiet suburban home, the foundation was already beginning to crumble. Sophia had begun to pull the strings, and Douglas, without realizing it, was becoming trapped in a story he didn't write. The love he thought he had found was an illusion, and the woman who had promised to build a future with him was slowly building something else, a lie powerful enough to destroy him completely. The change in their marriage came gradually, almost invisibly, like a shadow creeping across the floor as the sun went down. At first, Douglas thought Sophia was simply adjusting to her new life. She had gone from being a single woman with her own independence to living under one roof with a husband and a teenage stepdaughter, but soon her behavior became harder to explain. She grew distant, snapping at small things and then apologizing with forced sweetness. Her moods shifted like weather, one moment affectionate, the next icy and sharp. Douglas began to notice strange patterns. Sophia would disappear for hours, saying she needed time to herself. She stopped going to her dance studio, and instead spent her days shopping or meeting friends he'd never heard of. When he asked questions, she accused him of being controlling. Sometimes she would cry, saying she didn't feel trusted, and Douglas, who hated confrontation, would back down. He wanted peace, and he still believed that love meant forgiveness. But beneath his patience, doubt had started to grow. The financial changes were the next warning sign. Large purchases appeared on their shared credit card. Designer clothes, expensive dinners, luxury spa visits. When Douglas confronted her gently, she laughed it off, claiming they both deserved to enjoy life. He didn't argue, but that night he stayed awake, staring at the ceiling, realizing how little control he had over his own household. What unsettled him most was that she no longer seemed to care about the things she once claimed mattered: her work, her art, or their relationship. Everything now revolved around image, attention, and control. His daughter Emily noticed it too. She told him she felt unwelcome, that Sophia treated her like a guest instead of family. When Douglas tried to talk to Sophia about it, she turned the situation around, accusing him of choosing his daughter over her. The argument left him feeling guilty and confused, unsure of how to keep peace between the two most important women in his life. What he didn't know was that Sophia was slowly isolating him, making sure he would have no one left to turn to when things went wrong. Rumors began to reach him through mutual acquaintances. People had seen Sophia in restaurants with other men, laughing, holding hands, looking nothing like a married woman. Douglas tried to ignore it, telling himself people exaggerated, that Sophia wouldn't betray him like that. But deep down he couldn't ignore the signs. Her late-night texts, the perfume that didn't smell like hers, the coldness in her eyes when he mentioned the future, they all painted a picture he didn't want to see. One night, after a particularly tense argument, Douglas left the house and drove aimlessly through the quiet streets. The air felt heavy, his chest tight with unspoken fear. When he returned, the lights in the house were off except for one lamp in the living room. Sophia sat on the couch, scrolling through her phone, not looking up when he entered. The silence between them was no longer peaceful, it was suffocating. He wanted to speak, to ask what had happened to the woman he had married, but he knew she would twist his words. So he said nothing. Days turned into weeks, and their home began to feel less like a refuge and more like a cage. Douglas became quieter, distracted at work, haunted by a sense of dread he couldn't explain. He noticed small things missing. Important papers, keys, even his checkbook once disappeared for 2 days. When he asked about them, Sophia shrugged and changed the subject. He wanted to believe it was just carelessness, but a deep unease had taken root. Then came the night the neighbors would never forget. They heard shouting through the walls, his voice low and pleading, hers sharp and furious. A door slammed, followed by silence. The next morning, Douglas appeared outside, walking to his car with a scratch running down his cheek and a look in his eyes that unsettled those who saw him. When asked, he brushed it off, saying it was nothing. But it was something. It was the beginning of the end. Behind closed doors, Sophia was rewriting the story of their marriage, preparing the world to see herself as the victim and Douglas as the villain. Every insult, every tear, every manipulation was a thread in the web she was weaving. And while Douglas still clung to the hope that things could somehow return to the way they once were, Sophia had already decided that the marriage would end, not with words or divorce papers, but with something far more final. Sophia's transformation from a troubled wife to a calculating manipulator was nearly complete. By the time Douglas began considering divorce, she had already started crafting her version of events. one where she was the wronged woman trapped in a dangerous marriage. To friends, she hinted that Douglas was becoming controlling, even violent. She told stories of being followed, of having her phone checked, of being shouted at in private. None of it was true, but she told the stories with trembling hands and a cracked voice, ensuring that anyone who heard them would believe her. Slowly, she began to shape a narrative that painted Douglas as a threat and herself as his helpless victim. At the same time, she started documenting things, photos of small bruises she inflicted on herself, text messages edited to look like he was angry, and audio clips taken out of context. When police would later review them, they would realize how carefully everything had been constructed. Sophia was not acting on impulse. She was preparing for an outcome. Every story she told, every lie she spread was part of a larger plan. Douglas, meanwhile, was breaking down in silence. He had always been patient, always believed that kindness could fix what was broken. But Sophia's constant accusations, her sudden disappearances, and her shifting moods had exhausted him. He spoke to a lawyer quietly, asking about the divorce process, about protecting his assets, and about how to ensure his daughter would be safe. The lawyer advised caution, warning him that Sophia seemed volatile. Douglas nodded, unaware that Sophia had already discovered the emails he had sent about the separation. Once she found out, her behavior changed again. For days she was unusually affectionate, cooking his favorite meals, smiling at him, suggesting they start over. Douglas wanted to believe it. Against his better judgment, he let himself hope that maybe the woman he had fallen in love with was still there. But beneath her warmth was something cold, deliberate, and dangerous. Sophia was setting the stage for what she would later call the night everything went wrong. It began with a simple text. "Can we talk tonight?" Sophia claimed she wanted to meet and discuss their future. She suggested the house they had once shared, saying it felt right to have closure there. Douglas hesitated. Something about it felt off, but he couldn't bring himself to refuse. He wanted peace, and maybe deep down he still wanted to believe that Sophia loved him, even just a little. That evening, Douglas arrived at the house carrying a calm expression and an uneasy heart. The home looked exactly as he remembered, neat, quiet, ordinary. Sophia greeted him with a soft smile. Neighbors would later recall seeing his car parked in the driveway, the porch light glowing faintly in the warm night air. Then came the sound, a single sharp crack that shattered the calm suburban silence. When police arrived, they found Sophia sitting on the living room floor, trembling, phone in hand. Douglas lay motionless a few feet away, a gunshot wound to his chest. She was crying, repeating over and over that she had been attacked, that she had no choice. To the responding officers, it looked tragic but plausible. The house appeared disturbed, furniture pushed aside, objects scattered. She claimed Douglas had broken in, enraged about their separation, and tried to hurt her. In fear, she said, she reached for the gun. But something didn't add up. Douglas's car keys and phone were neatly placed on the counter. His shoes showed no dirt or sign of forced entry. There were no defensive wounds on Sophia, only faint marks on her arm that looked too precise to be from a struggle. The position of the body, the blood pattern, the angle of the shot, none of it fit her story. Still, that night, the police took her statement and let her go home. Neighbors whispered about the tragedy, believing Sophia's tearful version of events. Douglas's friends, however, were not convinced. They knew his nature, his calmness, his refusal to resort to anger. Something was wrong. Something about the scene, about the timing, about Sophia's performance felt rehearsed. As the news spread and condolences poured in, Sophia appeared composed, almost detached. She wore black to the memorial, spoke softly about forgiveness, and thanked people for their support. But behind that polished appearance, she was waiting, hoping her plan had worked, that her lies were strong enough to hold. What she didn't know was that the truth was already unraveling, piece by piece, and that the mask she had worn so carefully was about to crack in ways she could never control. The investigation into Douglas Benefield's death began with sympathy for Sophia. Her tears, her trembling voice, and her claims of self-defense painted a picture that police initially accepted. She described a terrifying night, a violent husband, and a desperate act to save her life. It sounded convincing, but as detectives walked through the house again, small details began to whisper a different story. The first sign was the lack of struggle. Apart from a few toppled items, the living room was oddly neat. The coffee table had a single overturned mug, and the rug beneath Douglas's body was barely disturbed. If there had been a fight, it should have looked chaotic. Instead, it looked staged. Forensic experts quickly noticed other inconsistencies. Douglas's fingerprints were found only on his phone, his keys, and a folder he had brought with him. There were none on the weapon Sophia claimed he tried to grab from her. In fact, the gun had residue only from her hands. The bullet trajectory suggested Douglas was seated when shot, not standing or attacking. These details quietly tore holes in Sophia's story. As detectives continued their work, they requested phone records, text messages, and emails. What they found revealed a pattern of manipulation. In the weeks leading up to the shooting, Sophia had been telling friends she was terrified of her husband, that he was stalking her, and that she feared he might kill her. But she had no police reports, no witnesses, no evidence of abuse. What she did have were messages she had crafted to look incriminating. Snippets of arguments and screenshots edited to make Douglas appear threatening. Experts later discovered inconsistencies in timestamps and language, proving she had altered them. Then came the financial trail. Bank statements showed large withdrawals from Douglas's accounts, all tied to purchases Sophia had made. She had maxed out credit cards, moved funds between accounts, and even tried to open a new line of credit in his name. When questioned, she claimed he had authorized it, but the timing painted a clearer picture. She knew Douglas was preparing to cut her off. His will had been recently updated to remove her entirely, something she would have found devastating. Motive was beginning to take shape, and it wasn't fear. It was greed. When investigators finally confronted her with the evidence, Sophia's composure began to crack. Her answers changed with each interview. At first, she said Douglas came to the house angry. Then she claimed he had a gun of his own. Later, she said she couldn't remember exactly what happened. Detectives recognized the behavior. They had seen it before in those who believed they could outsmart the system. Her tears seemed rehearsed now, her tone measured, her pauses deliberate. Meanwhile, Douglas's friends and family provided a very different version of him. They described a man who was calm, rational, and incapable of violence. His daughter, Emily, testified that he had planned to meet Sophia that night only to discuss signing divorce papers. He wasn't angry. He was tired. The last message he sent to a friend before leaving simply read, "Wish me luck. Maybe this will finally end." That message, short and ordinary, carried a quiet tragedy that investigators could not ignore. As the case grew stronger, Sophia's performance faltered. Her confident facade melted under the weight of evidence she couldn't explain. Ballistics confirmed that Douglas was shot from several feet away, not in a struggle. Surveillance cameras from nearby homes showed her leaving the house after the gunshot, walking calmly to her car before calling 911 nearly 15 minutes later. It was a delay that shattered her claim of panic. The prosecution built their case around one simple truth. Sophia Lane had never been afraid of Douglas Benefield. She had been afraid of losing what he provided. Her love had been an act, carefully performed until the moment it no longer served her purpose. When the jury heard the recordings, saw the altered texts, and reviewed the forensic analysis, their expressions turned from pity to disgust. During the verdict, Sophia sat expressionless, eyes fixed forward, as if she had already detached herself from the reality around her. The jurors took less than 3 hours to decide. Guilty, second-degree murder. When the sentence was read, there were no tears, no protests, no visible emotion. She stood there in silence, the same silence that had filled the house the night Douglas died. The courtroom emptied, leaving behind only whispers and the echo of a name, Douglas Benefield. His friends said justice had come too late, but at least the truth had been uncovered. Sophia's mask had finally slipped, revealing the cold calculation beneath the smile that had once charmed everyone who met her. The world now saw her for what she truly was. A woman who pretended to love, only to destroy the man who believed her lies. After the trial ended, Sophia Lane was taken away in silence. Cameras flashed as she was led from the courthouse in handcuffs, her once carefully styled hair now dull and her eyes hollow. The woman who had once smiled for photographs and charmed everyone she met was now a convicted murderer. Yet even as she disappeared behind the metal doors of a prison van, there was no visible remorse, no hint of understanding that her lies had destroyed a life. For Douglas's family, the verdict was justice, but it could never be enough to fill the void he left behind. Douglas Benefield's funeral had taken place months earlier, long before the trial. Friends and colleagues filled the small church, each person carrying memories of a man who had tried to live with kindness and reason. His daughter, Emily, sat in the front row, her hands clenched tightly together, staring at the framed photo of her father smiling in the sunlight. She had testified in court, reliving the worst moments of her life so that the truth could be heard. When the verdict came, she didn't cry. Instead, she walked outside, stood under the sky her father had loved so much, and whispered a quiet promise to never let his story fade. The house where everything had happened stood empty for months. The windows remained closed, curtains drawn, grass growing wild around the edges. People who passed by said it felt cold even on warm days. Neighbors avoided looking directly at it, remembering the night of flashing lights and sirens. Eventually, the property was sold to a young couple who had no connection to what had happened. They repainted the walls, replaced the furniture, and tried to give the house a new beginning. Still, those who had lived nearby for years said they could never forget the sound of that single gunshot echoing through the quiet street. Inside prison, Sophia quickly became an object of fascination. Her story spread across television and social media, with commentators dissecting every detail of her life. To some, she was a monster, cold, manipulative, and cruel. To others, she was a woman who had lost control, a victim of her own greed and pride. Sophia seemed to enjoy the attention at first. She gave short interviews, carefully choosing her words to sound tragic and misunderstood. But as time passed, the world moved on. New stories replaced hers, and the attention she once craved disappeared. Without an audience, Sophia faded into obscurity, spending her days in quiet isolation. Those who worked at the prison described her as polite but detached. She rarely spoke to anyone and often sat alone, reading or writing letters that were never sent. Some inmates said she still rehearsed her version of the story, insisting she had been the victim. Others claimed she spent hours staring at her reflection, whispering to herself as if trying to remember who she once was. No one ever saw her cry. Meanwhile, Douglas's name lived on in the community he had once served. His company established a scholarship in his memory for young engineers, and his daughter went on to study law, determined to fight for victims of manipulation and abuse. People who had known him said that was exactly what he would have wanted, to turn pain into purpose, to help others even in his absence. Over time, the story of Douglas and Sophia became one more entry in the long list of true crime tragedies, a tale of charm, deception, and misplaced trust. But for those who had known Douglas, it was more than a cautionary story. It was a reminder of how easily love can be twisted, how dangerous it becomes when used as a weapon. Sophia had pretended to love him, but in the end, it was her pretense that destroyed her. Years later, an old neighbor who still lived on the street said she sometimes saw a man standing outside that house at night, hands in his pockets, just looking at it quietly before walking away. She never spoke to him, But she believed it was Douglas's brother visiting to remember. The house itself had been repainted, the yard trimmed, the lights glowing warmly from inside. Yet even with its new life there was a stillness about it, a sense that it remembered what had happened within its walls. And so the story of Douglas Benefield lingered like a faint echo, a warning disguised as love. It began as a romance, bright and full of promise, and ended with silence and loss. Sophia's lies had cost her everything, and the man she claimed to love had paid the ultimate price. Time moved on, but the truth remained, carved into memory like a scar that never fades. She pretended to love him, and in doing so, destroyed them both.